Hello friends, welcome back to my channel, and a bit of a welcome back to me as well. I have not posted a video all summer, basically, and that is a combination of not feeling motivated to film and also being legitimately busy. So at this point, I felt like the best way to do this is to just make a video about all the books that I read this summer. So this will include everything that I've read in June, July, and August. I'm going to try to really condense my thoughts so this isn't crazy long. So these will be, kind of mini reviews compared to what I usually do. Go through these as fast as I can, so forgive me if I'm speaking really fast. And I'm just going to go through these in the order that I read them, starting with June, which was my most productive reading month. The Last Magician by Lisa Maxwell and narrated by Candice Thaxton. This is a YA contemporary historical fantasy that takes place in New York, and this girl time travels back to the early 1900s to try to save magic and magic users, and there are gangs and heists. And this was a 2-star, 2 out of 5 for me. I didn't care about basically anything or anyone in this book, except for maybe the actual last magician himself. I did kind of like him. The magic system was nebulous, which I'm not a huge fan of usually. I didn't feel the urgency of the plot, and it felt like nothing happened until everything happened. And I didn't really like the audiobook narration. So this was just overall a big flop for me, and I won't be continuing the series. House of Salt and Sorrows by Erin A. Craig. This is a YA fantasy horror mystery inspired by the 12 Dancing Princesses fairy tale, and the main character, Annalay, is trying to find out the truth of what really happened to her sister who recently died, as well as what's going on with these magic otherworldly balls that she and her sisters start attending in the middle of the night in secret. And there are ghosts, and it's gothic, it's creepy and atmospheric, but it had more than just vibes. It was just overall just totally my brand of horror. It had some really scary moments. There is an insta-love romance that for some reason just worked for me here. I normally don't like insta-love. I loved the writing. This was 5 out of 5 stars, and a sequel actually just recently came out, I think in August, which I pre-ordered. I'm excited to read, but you can read this as a standalone, and I highly recommend it. I loved it. All That's Left in the World by Erik J. Brown, narrated by Barrett Letty and Andrew Gibson. And this is a YA post-apocalyptic romance about 2 boys, Andrew and Jameson, in the near future after a deadly illness has killed off most of humanity, and you follow their journey along the east coast of the US, trying to survive and understand their growing feelings for one another. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. This didn't do anything like particularly special for me, but it was a solid coming of age, gay awakening, post-apocalyptic story that isn't zombies or horror based. It's kind of slice of life almost for a lot of it, and it's queer rep in kind of this post-apocalyptic genre, which is apparently kind of scarce, so it was a solid read. Girls of Paper and Fire by Natasha Ngan. This is the first book in a YA fantasy series inspired by Malaysian culture, and it's about this girl named Lei who is taken to the palace of the Demon King to become a paper girl, which is basically a concubine. And there are humans and demons in this world separated by a caste system, and this follows her life in the palace where she dreams of escape and falls in love with one of her fellow paper girls. I gave this 2 out of 5 stars, rounded down from 2.5, and this was another situation of I just didn't care about most of the characters or the plot. It isn't action heavy, but there also isn't enough political intrigue either for me to say it's a political intrigue book. This book is mostly the main character being anxious and impotent and pining over her love interest. I was bored for most of it, and unfortunately I won't be continuing the series. Fate of Flames by Sarah Raughley. I adore this cover, and this is the first book in the F Effigies series. It's a YA contemporary fantasy where these 4 girls called the Effigies have the ability to manipulate elements and fight these creatures called phantoms. And the main character, Maya, has to grow into her role as the new effigy of fire and work with the others to hunt down this guy who is somehow able to control phantoms. And this was touted as Sailor Moon meets the Avengers meets Pacific Rim, which sounds amazing and fun, but this was actually a mess and not fun and really didn't deliver on most of those comparisons. I gave this 2 out of 5 stars. This wasn't boring, it was kind of action-packed, but the badassery I was waiting for never happened. Maya was useless and frustrating. The world building and plot is just not very convincing and cohesive, and I didn't have like super high expectations, but this was still kind of disappointing, and I don't plan to continue the series. So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. This is a nonfiction that breaks down some concepts that are important to understanding systemic racism and how to start talking about it and confronting it. This was a 5-star. This was very accessible. The language was straightforward and clear. The author provides a lot of first-hand experiences to help reiterate the things she's talking about, and there's a lot of, defining things and providing background and guidance on how to talk about it. And I think that this is a really good kind of beginner entry point into the topic. The Wild Ones by Nafiza Azad, another of just a super gorgeous cover. This is a contemporary fantasy following this group of girls called the Wild Ones who find this boy who has a connection to this magical place called the Between, and they decide to protect him from someone who's hunting him. The Wild Ones are magical and were once human girls who experienced abuse and trauma. And this was a 4 out of 5 that I rounded down from 4.5. This was a really unique and beautiful story told mostly from a we perspective and focused kind of on a collective experience of women trying to just live after experiencing horrible things. It was very dreamy and melancholy and lyrical and kind of just hard to describe, but it was very beautiful. There were moments where I was kind of itching for something more intense just because that's my general preference, but I really enjoyed it overall. The last thing I read in June was the audiobook for Critical Role Vox Machina, Kith and Kin by Marieke Nijkamp. This is a fantasy based off of 2 sibling characters, Vax and Vex, from the Critical Role web series stream, which is a group of nerdy ass voice actors playing Dungeons and Dragons. And this takes place before their first campaign, and the twins get involved in this heist mission that kicks off wrong, and the 2 end up being separated and wind up on opposite sides of this local conflict. I really enjoyed this as an audiobook. In particular, I recommend going this route because Liam O'Brien and Laura Bailey, who play Vax and Vex in the campaign, voice their characters in the book, and this was like a 3.5 rounded up to 4. The pacing wasn't always great, which was my main complaint, but the banter between Vax and Vex and just the brother-sister relationship was really great. I might not necessarily recommend it for people who haven't either watched Vox Machina, the show, or watched the actual D&D campaign, but you don't have to have seen either of them to read this and enjoy it. Alright, so now on to the books that I read in July, starting with my very last Owl Crate book, which was Midnight Strikes by Zeba Shanaz. This is a YA fantasy with a time loop following this girl who finds herself somehow reliving this ball at the royal palace where these explosions go off at midnight and everyone dies. And she has to figure out how to stop this from recurring forever and figure out how to break the time loop. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I did enjoy it, but I didn't love it. The new things that you learn, during the iterations are really drip fed to you a little too slowly. It also got kind of depressing and like fatalistic, which I personally didn't find enjoyable. And there's a weird one-sided romance that is just weird and not satisfying. So it was okay. The Sisters Grimm by Menna van Praag. This is about these 4 girls who live in London who are Sisters Grimm, which means that they have these inherent elemental powers, but they have to sort of discover those powers first to fight against their father, who is a demon trying to get them to turn towards the side of the dark and evil. This was a 3.5 that I rounded down to 3. I did enjoy it. It has some flowery writing and a kind of a dark overtone, but the pacing was very slow. It isn't as action-packed as the blurb made it sound. It's more character-driven, but the girls were each unique and mostly interesting, some maybe more than others. And this is the first of, I think, a trilogy, but you could read it as a standalone. And I liked it, but I don't have any plans to continue the series. Witches of Ash and Ruin by E. Latimer, narrated by Catherine Lee McEwen. This is a contemporary witchy fantasy that takes place in Ireland following a girl named Dana, and she and her coven have to join forces with this other coven that comes into town to try and stop these murders by a serial killer who is targeting witches. And I had a good time. I think this is another 3.5. I am rounding down to 3 though, even though I did enjoy it. There are queer main characters and a romance that I didn't particularly care about, but it wasn't bad. I think others could probably really like it. I wish that more focus had been put on kind of the tension of witchcraft versus Dana's small religious town, but there wasn't as much focus on that as I would have liked. There is real magic and supernatural things going on, which I love, but there's no indication anywhere that I could find on the internet that this is a series, but this book absolutely does not end like a standalone. So I wouldn't recommend this unless you literally don't care about things not wrapping up by the end of a book. Street Freaks by Terry Brooks. This is a YA sci-fi that takes place in Los Angeles in the far future, about a boy named Ash who is being hunted down by authorities for reasons unknown to him, and the only clue he has is his father sending him a message to find street freaks. And he meets other misfit kids and is trying to find out what happened to his father and this conspiracy. I gave this 1 star. Maybe 1.5, but I definitely could not round this up to 2. Long story short, I had sworn off Terry Brooks after having a bad time reading the first 3 books in his very famous fantasy series, Shannara. I only read this for a reading challenge prompt, which was giving an author a second chance. And it did not work out. This was written in a very boring tone of voice. The characters were flat, and Terry Brooks was in his early 70s when he wrote this, and you can just tell by how outdated everything feels in his future. And he also wrote a young female character who is a sex bot created exclusively to pleasure rich men. I cringed so many times reading this. I know I'm not the target audience, but I would not recommend this to anyone. Cannot wait to get rid of this. Locklands by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is the last book in the Founders trilogy, which is a steampunk fantasy with a really cool magic system that's called scriving, and it involves sigils that can convince objects to behave differently than they normally do. And you start the series in book 1 following a thief named Sancha who gets more than she bargained for when she steals this powerful artifact and goes up against the merchant houses who rule the city. And this last book takes place over a decade after book 1, and the magic system just kept wowing me in terms of what it can do, and it's so crazy and cool. It does get pretty technical with how it works, explaining how it works, which some people I know found tedious, but I loved it. I love like intricate magic systems, and this was a 4.5, rounding up to 5 stars. The ending was so emotional and intense. Like, as I was reading, my heart just actually was just hurting for what the characters go through. I love the characters. This was an awesome series. I loved it, and I recommend it, especially if you enjoy Brandon Sanderson's very well thought out and utilized magic systems and his kind of more simple writing style. The last thing I finished in July was the audiobook for The Alchemists of Loom by Elisa Kova, narrated by Tim Campbell and Erin Moon. And this is the first book in the Loom saga, which is a young adult, new adult steampunk fantasy following this woman named Ariana, who agrees to help this man named Savare in exchange for a magically granted boon. And Ariana is a Fenthri who, as a people, have been subjugated by Savare's people, the dragons. But Savare wants to overthrow the Dragon King and needs Ariana's help to deliver something to the Alchemists Guild that might help make that happen. I gave this 3 out of 5. I liked the setting and the world that you're kind of just thrown into. I was pretty indifferent to most of the characters though, and I didn't care about the budding romance. I also didn't really like Tim Campbell's narration throughout the series, so that made things kind of annoying for me to listen to. And then in August, I actually finished the Loom saga, which is a trilogy, and the second book is The Dragons of Nova, and I gave this 3 out of 5 stars as well. Maybe rounded down from 3.5. I liked it more than the first book. You see more of the dragons culture up in the sky world of Nova versus the first book that takes place down on the Fenthri world of Loom. There are some cool characters introduced in the second book, but the main character Ariana gets more and more insufferable and annoying as the series progresses, in my opinion. So the last book in the series is The Rebels of Gold, and the fight for the freedom against the dragons comes to a head. And I also gave this 3 stars. The whole series was a very easy read, very quick read, and it was entertaining for the most part. I just did not like Ariana, and I rolled my eyes at most of the romance. Romance isn't my thing. There are parts of the world building and plot that were cool and interesting, and then other parts were not really explained well. The writing at times read corny and cringy. I was satisfied enough with the ending, but there were a couple things that felt like loose threads. I don't regret reading this series, but it wasn't like anything mind-blowing. I gave every book 3 stars, so, you know, take of that what you will. And then the final book that I'll talk about is Tokyo Ever After by Emiko Jean. This is a YA contemporary about this girl named Izumi, born and raised in America, who learns that her dad is the Crown Prince of Japan, making her a princess. And you follow her as she visits Japan for the first time and falls for her handsome and uptight bodyguard. This was a 4 out of 5 stars. I had a fun time with it. It made me smile, made me chuckle, and I enjoyed the romance a lot, actually. And I think that Izumi is relatable. She deals with feeling like she doesn't belong. It isn't super plot driven. You just kind of see Izumi experiencing Japan and occasionally getting in trouble with the Japanese press. This was another easy read. There is a sequel that I would pick up if I saw it, like, I don't know, on sale or used or something. This book ends on a hopeful but pretty open note. You know, recommend if you're feeling nostalgic for the Princess Diaries, but in Japan instead of Genovia. And those are all the books I read this summer. That is 17 books, I believe. I counted beforehand, and they really ran the gamut of ratings. I even gave out a 1-star, which I haven't done in a few years. I don't give a lot of books 1 star. If you want to see my full thoughts on any of these, check out the links in the description. I always link my Goodreads reviews for everything I talk about in wrap-ups and videos. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you started at the top and made it all the way to the end. I really appreciate anyone who takes the time to check out my content, especially, if you make it here to the end from the beginning, but even if you do jump around just to the books that you're interested in, I appreciate the view. I also finally created an Instagram to post bookish content, which is a Libra Reads with underscores between the words. I'll put it on the screen. Follow me there if you're interested. I'll really do my best not to let another 3 months pass before uploading a video. I know this one was a long one. I'll have to see how long. I really tried to condense it to not make it so long, but this might be on the longer side. So again, thank you for joining me. Let me know if you've read any of these and what you thought of them. I read a lot of books that have been on my Goodreads TBR for years, so a lot of backlist titles that people have kind of already read and I can finally weigh in on. I hope you had a good summer, because we're nearing the end and are ready for cozy and spooky season to hit, and I will see you in my next one, hopefully not in 3 months. Bye!